Sometimes the most profound acts of kindness happen in plain sight, unnoticed by everyone except the person whose life is being quietly saved. What unfolded on the Ellen DeGeneres show on this particular Thursday afternoon would remind everyone watching that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear aprons and serve coffee with a smile that hides the deepest compassion. The studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy. Ellen had just finished her opening dance. The audience was still laughing from her monologue about trying to assemble IKEA furniture, and the warm California sun streamed through the windows, casting everything in that golden glow that made every moment feel cinematic. Jake Morrison sat in the green room, nervously adjusting his worn denim jacket for the third time. At 21, he had the kind of earnest face that belonged on a college brochure: bright hazel eyes, an easy smile, and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time in library carols than in front of mirrors. But beneath that youthful optimism was something else: the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to make do with very little. Jake had never imagined he'd be sitting backstage at the Ellen show. 6 months earlier, he had submitted a video essay for a contest called Everyday Heroes, thinking it would be just another scholarship application that disappeared into the digital void. He had written about his daily routine, his studies, his dreams of becoming a social worker. Nothing particularly extraordinary, he thought. What he didn't know was that his essay had moved the producers to tears. The essay was titled My Office, and it described in simple, honest prose how Jake spent 12 hours a day studying at Corner Café, a small coffee shop 3 blocks from his university. He wrote about the corner table by the window where he'd memorized calculus formulas, written English papers, and prepared for exams. He described how the ambient noise helped him concentrate, how the warmth kept him comfortable during Oregon's brutal winters, and how the free Wi-Fi kept him connected to his online classes. What Jake hadn't mentioned in his essay, what he would never think to mention, was that in 3 years of daily visits to Corner Café, he had never actually ordered anything. Behind the scenes, Ellen's producers had done something they rarely did. They had contacted Jake's university and spoken with his professors. What they discovered was a young man who, despite financial hardships, maintained a 3.8 GPA while working 20 hours a week and volunteering at a local homeless shelter on weekends. His social work professor had written in a recommendation letter, "Jake Morrison understands poverty not as an academic concept, but as a lived experience that has shaped his profound empathy for others." "Jake Morrison, you're up in 5 minutes," a production assistant announced, poking her head into the green room. Jake nodded, took a deep breath, and tried to calm the butterflies that had taken up permanent residence in his stomach. Ellen's introduction was warm and enthusiastic. "My next guest wrote an essay that absolutely blew me away. He's a college student who's redefining what it means to find your place in the world. Please welcome Jake Morrison." The audience applauded as Jake walked onto the stage, his nervousness evident but endearing. Ellen greeted him with her signature hug, and something about her genuine warmth immediately put him at ease. "So, Jake," Ellen said, as they settled onto the iconic white couch, "tell me about your office." Jake's face lit up immediately. "Oh, Corner Café. It's this amazing little coffee shop near campus. I spend pretty much all my free time there. The owner, Mrs. Chen, creates this incredible atmosphere. It's like being in someone's living room, but with really good music and the smell of fresh coffee everywhere." Ellen leaned forward with interest. "And you've been going there for how long?" 3 years, Jake replied proudly. "Since my freshman year? I discovered it during my first week at university when I was looking for a quiet place to study. The dorms are pretty loud, and the library can be intimidating. But Corner Café just felt safe." "That's a long time to be a regular customer," Ellen said with a smile. "Mrs. Chen must know your usual order by heart." Something flickered across Jake's expression, so briefly that most people would have missed it. But Ellen had been interviewing people long enough to catch these micro-expressions, these tiny moments when someone's carefully constructed narrative wobbled slightly. "She's incredibly kind," Jake said, not quite answering the question. "The way she takes care of all her customers is just remarkable." Ellen's producer instincts were pinging. There was a story here, something Jake wasn't saying. But she had learned over 19 years of hosting that sometimes the best approach was to simply create space for people to share what they were ready to share. "Tell me what a typical day looks like for you there," Ellen said gently. Jake's smile became more natural as he settled into describing his routine. "I usually get there around 7 a.m., right when they open. I have this table by the window, table 7, where I've basically lived for 3 years. I bring my laptop, my textbooks, and I just exist there. I take online classes, so I need reliable Wi-Fi. And Mrs. Chen's never once complained about me camping out all day?" "All day?" Ellen asked. "Well, yeah. I'm usually there until around 7 p.m., 12 hours, give or take. I know it sounds excessive, but it's the perfect study environment, and Mrs. Chen makes everyone feel so welcome." Ellen was doing mental math, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 3 years. At any coffee shop, that would represent thousands of dollars in purchases. She was beginning to understand what Jake wasn't saying. "Jake," Ellen said softly, "can I ask you something personal?" Jake nodded, though his posture tensioned slightly. "What's your financial situation like? Are you working while you're in school?" The question Jake had been dreading, the one that made him feel ashamed despite knowing he had nothing to be ashamed of. He looked down at his hands, then back up at Ellen with the kind of honesty that only comes from someone who had given up pretending. "I'm on full financial aid," he said quietly. "Work-study program, student loans, the whole thing. My mom raised me alone, and she's been amazing, but college is expensive. I work 20 hours a week in the campus bookstore, but after tuition, books, rent, there's not much left over for things like coffee." The studio had grown noticeably quieter. Ellen felt her heart beginning to break for this young man who was explaining his situation with such dignity. "So, when you spend 12 hours a day at Corner Café," Ellen began gently. "I just sit there," Jake said simply. "Sometimes I'll order a glass of water. Mrs. Chen has never made me feel unwelcome, never pressured me to buy anything. She just lets me exist in her space, and that kindness has literally kept me in school." The audience was completely silent now. Several people in the front row had tears in their eyes. Ellen felt that familiar tightness in her chest that always preceded her most emotional interviews. "Jake, that takes incredible courage," Ellen said, "to go into a business every day and just be honest about your situation." "Mrs. Chen makes it easy," Jake replied. "She's never made me feel like a charity case or like I don't belong. She treats me exactly like every other customer, even though—" His voice trailed off. "Even though what?" Jake hesitated, then smiled sadly. "Even though we both know I can't afford to actually be a customer." That's when Ellen made the decision that would change everything. She looked toward her producers in the booth and made a subtle gesture they had come to recognize over the years, the signal that meant, whatever happens next, keep rolling. "Jake," Ellen said, "I think there's someone who might want to meet you." Jake looked confused. "What do you mean?" Ellen smiled mysteriously and looked toward the stage entrance. "Mrs. Chen, would you like to come out here?" Jake's face went completely white. He spun around to see a small, elegant Asian woman in her 50s walking onto the stage, wearing a simple black dress and the biggest smile Ellen had ever seen. "Mrs. Chen," Jake exclaimed, jumping up from the couch so quickly he nearly knocked over the coffee table. "What are you doing here?" Linda Chen approached Jake with tears already streaming down her face. Without a word, she pulled him into the kind of hug that speaks to years of silent understanding, mutual respect, and unspoken care. "Hello, my dear boy," Mrs. Chen said softly, her slight accent making her words even more tender. Surprise. Ellen waited for them to separate before addressing Mrs. Chen directly. "Thank you so much for being here. I have to ask, did you know about Jake's situation?" Mrs. Chen looked at Jake with such affection that it made the entire studio ache. "Of course I knew," she said simply. "From the first week." Jake stared at her in shock. "You knew?" "Jake, sweet boy, you think I don't notice when someone sits at my cafe for 12 hours and orders only water? You think I don't see when a young man counts quarters before deciding he can't afford a cookie?" Jake's face crumpled slightly. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Chen. I never wanted to take advantage—" "Stop," Mrs. Chen said firmly, placing her hand on his arm. "You listen to me. You have never taken advantage of anything. You have given my cafe something more valuable than money." Ellen leaned forward, fascinated. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Chen turned to address both Ellen and the audience. "For 3 years, Jake has been my most dedicated customer. He arrives every morning with a smile and a greeting. He stays quietly in his corner, never bothering anyone, always polite to other customers. He helps elderly people with their laptops, explains homework to high school students, and once he helped a mother change her baby's diaper when she couldn't manage alone." Jake looked stunned. "You saw all that?" "I see everything in my cafe," Mrs. Chen replied with a gentle smile. "But more than that, Jake represents something I hoped for when I opened Corner Café 15 years ago. I wanted to create a space where people could belong, where community could happen naturally. Jake turned my business into what I always dreamed it could be." Ellen was openly crying now. "But Mrs. Chen, if you knew Jake couldn't afford to buy anything, why didn't you ever say something?" Mrs. Chen's answer would become one of the most quoted moments in Ellen show history. "Because the most beautiful gifts are the ones that preserve dignity," she said simply. "Jake needed a place to belong, and I needed someone to show me that my cafe was actually serving its purpose. We were helping each other, even if he didn't realize it." Jake was sobbing now, and Ellen reached over to put her arm around him. "There's more," Mrs. Chen continued. "Jake, you think you just sit there, but you don't. Every morning you straighten chairs before you sit down. You wipe down your table when you leave. You always say please and thank you, even when you're ordering water. And when other customers see you studying so diligently, day after day, it inspires them. Parents point you out to their children as an example of dedication." What Mrs. Chen didn't tell the audience, but would later share privately with Ellen, was that Jake had become something of a legend among her regular customers. Business executives would quietly ask her about the dedicated student in the corner, and several had left anonymous donations specifically to help with his coffee tab. A retired professor had started bringing extra pastries for whoever might need them, always making sure Jake got one. Even local high school students had begun studying harder, inspired by seeing someone their age so focused and determined. Ellen stood up abruptly. "I need to do something," she announced to the studio. "Mrs. Chen, Jake has been a customer at your cafe for 3 years. If he had been able to afford coffee every day, what would that have cost?" Mrs. Chen thought for a moment. "A regular coffee is $3.50. If he had 1 coffee per day for 3 years, maybe $3,800. Ellen nodded and walked to her desk. She returned with her personal checkbook, not a prop, but the real thing. "Jake," Ellen said, "I'm writing Mrs. Chen a check for $4,000. That covers your coffee tab for the past 3 years, plus interest." The audience erupted, but Ellen held up her hand. "But that's not all. Mrs. Chen, I want to sponsor Jake as a permanent customer at your cafe. Here's another check for $5,000. That should cover his coffee, food, and anything else he needs for the rest of his college career." Jake was speechless, looking back and forth between Ellen and Mrs. Chen as if he couldn't quite process what was happening. "And Jake," Ellen continued, "Corner Café isn't just your office anymore. It's your office with full coffee privileges." But Mrs. Chen had her own surprise. "Ellen, that's incredibly generous, but I have something to say too." She turned to face Jake directly. "Jake, I want to offer you a job." "A job?" Jake stammered. "I've been looking for someone to help me expand Corner Café, someone who understands what it means to create community, who values the space as much as I do. I want you to help me open a second location and eventually take over the business when I retire." Ellen's mouth fell open. "Mrs. Chen, are you serious?" "Completely serious," Mrs. Chen replied. "Jake has spent 3 years proving he understands the heart of what Corner Café is supposed to be. Who better to help it grow?" Jake looked like he might faint. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Ellen and Mrs. Chen said simultaneously, causing the audience to burst into laughter and applause. "Yes," Jake whispered, then louder, "Yes." The three of them stood together on the stage, and Ellen realized this was one of those moments that transcended television, that reminded everyone watching that kindness creates kindness, that dignity matters, and that sometimes the most powerful connections happen between people who choose to see each other's humanity. But the surprises weren't over. During the commercial break, Ellen had made several phone calls. When they returned to air, she had one more announcement. "Jake, Mrs. Chen, I've been making some calls during the break. It turns out that when your story gets out there, amazing things happen." Ellen smiled mysteriously. "I've been contacted by the dean of your university, Jake. They want to offer you a full academic scholarship for your final year, and they're creating an internship program where students can work with local businesses to strengthen community connections." Mrs. Chen gasped. "They want to replicate what happened naturally at Corner Café?" "Exactly," Ellen replied. "And there's more. The mayor of your city called. They want to designate Corner Café as the first community heart business, a place that exemplifies how businesses can serve their communities beyond just commerce." Jake was overwhelmed, tears streaming down his face as he tried to process how his life had changed in the span of one television appearance. 6 months later, Jake was managing the original Corner Café while Mrs. Chen prepared to open their second location. He graduated magna cum laude with his social work degree, but discovered his true calling was in creating spaces where people could belong. The original Corner Café became even more popular after the Ellen episode aired, but not because of the publicity. It became popular because people wanted to experience the kind of community that Jake and Mrs. Chen had created, a place where everyone was welcome, where dignity was preserved, and where the most important transactions weren't financial. Ellen visited Corner Café 6 months after the show and found Jake behind the counter serving coffee with the same warm smile Mrs. Chen had always worn. Table 7, his old studying spot, now had a small plaque that read, "Reserved for students who need a place to belong." And every morning, without fail, there was a student sitting at that table, studying diligently, sipping coffee that Jake made sure they could afford, continuing the cycle of quiet kindness that had started with a young man's honesty and a business owner's compassion. The university's internship program had expanded to include dozens of local businesses, creating a network of community-centered enterprises. Jake had become something of a consultant, helping other business owners understand how to balance profit with purpose, how to create spaces that served souls as much as they served customers. Mrs. Chen often said that the Ellen Show appearance had been wonderful, but the real magic had been happening long before the cameras arrived. It had been happening every morning when Jake straightened those chairs, every afternoon when he helped a struggling student with their homework, every evening when he thanked her for the water she had never charged him for. Because sometimes the most powerful moments happen not in grand gestures, but in the daily choice to see each other, to create space for dignity, and to understand that true community is built one act of kindness at a time.